You're listening to Market Champions, a podcast on navigating the financial markets. Here's your host, Srivatsan Prakash.
This episode of Market Champions is brought to you by Simplify ETFs. For more information, visit simplify.us. No simplified funds will be discussed during this podcast. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Market Champions. I just wanted to remind you to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Really helps the page grow, really helps the podcast grow. Thank you so much for your support. And now on to the interview. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Market Champions. Today I've got Mark Koyama. Mark is a professor at George Mason University. He recently wrote a book titled How the World Became Rich, The Historical Origins of Economic Growth, that he co-authored with Jared Rubin. And today, Mark and I, we're going to be talking about one, How the World Became Rich, his book, and some of the ideas that various countries can apply in order to generate higher economic growth and higher levels of prosperity, wealth, etc. So, Mark, thank you so much for being on the podcast, and thank you so much for your time today.
Great, yeah, I'm very happy to be here, and thanks for the invite.
Yep, Mark. So, I first wanted to start by asking you to tell the audience a little bit about your background, how you got into economics, and to an extent economic history, and how you got to where you are.
Okay, yeah. So I'm an economist. I did my PhD in Oxford in the UK in economics. I had an undergraduate in both history and economics. So I've always been interested in both those topics. Actually, originally, I think I was more interested in history, and then I switched to economics, partly because I thought it would be a better path to a career. And initially, I was interested in macro. I was interested in things like business cycles. But then I had some classes in economic history previously, and I ended up doing my dissertation for my MPhil, for my master's in economic history. And then when I started the PhD, it was the area I decided to go in, partly because of this comparative advantage I have in both having a strong background and training as a historian and as an economist as well. And so I've been working on a lot of topics in economic history since then. My influences are kind of broad, but I'm broadly speaking interested in institutions. And so I guess when I was a grad student, I was indirectly kind of influenced by Douglas North, Avner Greif, those types of scholars, people who are really thinking about the underlying institutions responsible for economic growth, as opposed to just simply measuring economic growth or simply looking at the policies. But I've taught economic history and also development economics for more than 10 years in both cases. So I'm kind of, it's partly why me and Jared wrote this book, because we've taught a lot of these papers, we've taught a lot of this research, we thought very deeply and for a long time about all the different kind of aspects of this question, how the world became rich.
Got it. And it is a very interesting topic, and sort of a lot of people have have tried to explain, sort of the dynamics of economic growth, and so why, some countries have experienced economic growth and while some have not. And so, let's start by talking. So if you're, when you start reading the book, so the first thing that you really talk about is geography. And I believe a lot of my listeners would be familiar with Peter Zeihan's work. And so Peter Zeihan has talked about how, so when you take the US, so the US is sort of in the perfect geographical location, and in the sense that it's surrounded by the Atlantic to the east, Pacific to the west. So you've got these massive oceans, and historically speaking, so it's been very hard to invade the US. And then you've got this network of rivers, you've got the perfect type of climate, you sort of got everything in the US. So when you think about geography, so how important is geography to to a country's economic growth, and especially in the modern age when let's say when one transport is a lot more modernized, a lot more advanced. So how important is geography today?
Yeah, it's a great question. So yeah, what we're doing in the book, in the first part of the book, is really surveying a lot of existing theories and accounts for the origins of economic growth. So when we're surveying the arguments about the role of geography, we're really kind of summarizing other people's research. And so But the first point I'd make is that the features that you pointed out about the United States, which seem to be conducive to economic growth today, were not necessarily propitious in the past, because, circa 1500, North America was sparsely populated and economically underdeveloped. So geography clearly matters, and I think Jared Diamond talks about how geography matters in particularly idiosyncratic historical ways. Jeffrey Sachs talks about how geography matters in terms of determining the cost of trade, something I'll touch on again. But then how geography matters is going to interact with things like the technology that's available or the climate. So if you think about the United States, you're saying, in some sense, it's very well, it's optimal in some sense in terms of its economic geography. But actually, even when the European settlers arrived in the United States, they were shocked by the climate of somewhere like Virginia, where I am now, because it's both hotter in the summer than a lot of parts of Europe, and it's colder in the winter. And so large parts of the south of the US were actually, I don't think, great for economic activity until air conditioning became available. So the technology also interacts with the climate, but geography still matters. So geography matters for access to trade. Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, large chunks of it, many countries are landlocked. And if those countries are landlocked, then we don't have access to the coast. And the coast or sea, gives you sea transport, and sea transport remains the lowest cost form of transport. That's particularly important when you're transporting goods like textiles, so goods which are high in volume but relatively low in value. So diamonds, you can fly them out of the country, right? They're worth it, because the value to volume ratio is very, very high. But it's not really economical to fly out cheap textiles. So it's much more economical to ship them. So a country like Bangladesh has an advantage in its access to the coast that, say, Niger or Botswana doesn't have. So that's some of the ways we think geography matters even today. But yeah, as you kind of noted, it does interact with the technology available, and also perhaps with the institutions available. You can ameliorate geography with high quality infrastructure, but again, in say Sub-Saharan Africa, the road network is often not very good. They don't necessarily have good trains, and they need to have good relationships with their neighbors. So to build, railways to the coast or roads to the coast, and those are often not present.
Right, and so one thing that has been a big change over, say, the last 5,000 years is 5,000 years ago, if you and I were alive, we would likely be farmers, and so, we've seen that shift away from a more agrarian society to something that's more industrialized, something that's based either on manufacturing or services. And so, do you think that's been a bigger part of why geography has declined in importance? Because, as you say in the book, geography is not fate, but there are many important instances where geography has been, paramount. So, would you say that big shift, has drastically reduced the value of geography?
That's right. Yeah, that's broadly speaking right. I would add to it an insight from economic geography, which is when economic geographers distinguish between kind of locational, relatively fixed characteristics of the land, say soil quality, right? So in an agrarian agricultural world, your soil quality is almost everywhere. I mean, it's not everywhere, but it's a lot. It matters a lot. So if you live in an area with not very good soil, then you're kind of you're stuck, you're screwed. But with manufacturing, that matters less. But maybe what matters more in today's world is economic geography, in the sense of access to infrastructure, and then access to proximity to other markets. And so that's, again, sometimes seen as part of the story for why the so-called East Asian miracle takes place. Obviously, there are certain policies, certain institutions in East Asia which are drivers of growth. But once those have got going, it seems like the fact that Hong Kong is doing well, Singapore is doing well, or South Korea doing well, Japan's doing well, then makes it a little bit easier for Taiwan or say Thailand to do better, right? Because they're close to an area which is booming. So proximity does have some does matter, even in a world of manufacturing, and even in a world of lower trade costs.
Got it. And that keyword that you mentioned was institutions. And so I wanted to talk about institutions next. And I think a lot of our conversation is going to revolve around institutions just because they are so important. And I know you've probably been asked this a million times, but what really makes good institutions? What should a country focus on in order to build a strong institutional foundation?
So the first thing I would say is just point out, but like the economists or the definition of institutions we're working with, which is really from Doug North, which is to think about institutions as the rules of a game. So they're a bit more meta than how like non-economists sometimes think about institutions. So non-economists might think of an institution like the Federal Reserve or a particular organization almost, and economists think about rules of the game, institutions as rules of the game. There's a little bit more of a meta level way of thinking about these things. And so again, and in that line of thinking, institutions structure incentives. And so you want to think about what incentives are the institutions providing. And a general way of thinking about it is, do those institutions encourage people to make the pie bigger, or to basically compete over getting a bigger share of the pie? And so, like you can create, so you could say, license taxis in New York City, give taxi drivers medallions, and then restrict the number of medallions, and you've made the medallion holders richer. But you maybe haven't made anyone else richer, you potentially made other people poorer. So you just have an institution which is transferring resources. And so the institutions which are going to be conducive to economic success are going to incentivize people to make the pie bigger. So that means incentivizing investment, incentivizing innovation. And so generally they're going to be along the lines of rewarding economic activity, which is creating output, not just redistributing output. So property rights are important, but they can't be the be all or end all, because in some cases, say with overly strong intellectual property right, potentially too strong property rights could be bad. But it's about thinking about those incentives. So rather than saying there's a one size fits all blueprint that you have to have, I think it's more that you should think about looking at a country's or society's institutions and thinking about what incentives they engender. And that sometimes means thinking about those institutions not in isolation, but how they interact with each other. That's a kind of general way of thinking about it. Obviously, if I think about specific countries or regions of the world or historical episodes, I could be more specific.
Got it. And Sinus, when at the end you mentioned specific parts of the world, and so I wanted to take Singapore as an example. And one thing that Singapore has done incredibly well is what was once a fishing village is now modern, highly successful city state. And broadly speaking, the Prime Minister of Singapore has more power compared to, say, the Prime Minister of the UK or the Prime Minister of Canada. And what allows some of these countries to be successful. For example, if we've seen throughout history that once you give the leader of a country all the power in the world, he usually goes on to destroy the country, become a dictator, turn institutions start to fail, etc. So what has allowed Singapore to hold itself together?
I'm not an expert in Singapore. I have been there a couple of times, and I do think it's a remarkable success story, but I'm not by any means an expert. What I would I'd say two things. Firstly, city-states can operate somewhat differently than larger polities. They have some kind of advantages. They have some disadvantages as well, because they're small. They can be crushed by their neighbors, but they also have some advantages. They don't have to worry about managing a large hinterland. But if you think about London, London is very successful and it's pretty rich, but the overall per capita level of income in the UK is a lot lower. So London looks less rich than, say, Singapore, but actually, if it was a city state, it would kind of be, I think it would be slightly richer or definitely comparable. So being small helps. Being close to a potential predator like China also helps, I think, concentrate the mind. And I think Lee Kuan Yew was potentially, we don't talk about this in a book, but if you ask me what role do leaders or individuals have in history, in general, I'm not on the side of like thinking they have a huge role. I don't believe in like a big man theory of history. I'm more likely to point out the role of institutions and other factors. But Lee Kuan Yew is plausibly of the late 20th century rulers, along with a couple of others like Nelson Mandela and I think Mikhail Gorbachev, a few others, Margaret Thatcher as well. He's one of the policymakers where you can say, look, individually, having this guy in charge plausibly made a difference. Like he was more competent, kind of some dimensions ruthless, but also cautious. And like if leaders have a role in explaining, why relatively successful policies are made and why mistakes are avoided, he is a candidate for a leader who mattered.
Yep. And do you think that Lee Kuan Yew as a person was more an altruist and that was what made a difference, or do you think he had better ideas? What was it about Lee Kuan Yew that significant that that mattered a great deal to Singapore versus say some leader in say a tin pot African dictatorship? What?
Yeah, so I don't think it's his. I don't think it's. I wouldn't ascribe much to altruism versus non-altruism as explanatory factors. So the incentives are given by the history of international situation as to why leaders in certain regimes behave differently than other parts of the world. But clearly, he time horizon seems to be relevant. Like he wasn't looking to maximize immediate gains. He was looking for putting in place policies which would play out over several decades. And he does seem to have been well read. In terms of understanding a lot of economics, reading kind of, I've read. I mean, he read Hayek and he interacted with Kissinger. He was probably more informed than your average post World War II leader, especially a leader of an independence movement. And he didn't buy into any of the faddish kind of extremist, kind of left wing academic trends which were going on at the time. He wasn't like a Pol Pot reading Sartre and Marx. So that may have mattered. But as I said, I'm not an expert on Lee Kuan Yew, so I by no means know his biography that well enough to comment on it authoritatively.
Yep, I see. And one more thing about, one last thing about when we talk about places like Singapore is that you mentioned that Singapore as a city-state functions slightly differently compared to countries with large land masses. And no, I would broadly argue that in Singapore, when you look at the state and the amount of power the state has, so if you look at say Temasek Corporation, which is a state-owned entity, you notice that they own a lot of companies in Singapore. You notice that just overall the state has a lot of power. And how if you had to sit down and structure say a larger economy, say Canada, or if you wanted to take a developing country, say a Democratic Republic of the Congo, how would you separate power between the state and the market?
Yeah, so this is definitely a good question, and it's a tricky question. So it's what I would say is that so there are advantages and dangers of this kind of corporatist model where the state and society are very closely intertwined, and the state plays a relatively large role in the economy. So in general, the dangers are that the state gets captured by the businessmen of the corporation. So it can lead to a lot of inefficiency and a lot of cronyism and a lot of corruption. It's particularly the case actually in larger economies, because in larger economies, they don't have to, a smaller part of the economy is integrated with the rest of the world. So trade is smaller. So there's in some sense more leeway to become more corrupt and to steal more. So in general, the state-led model of development, which was very popular across the world after World War II, in some sense inspired by the seeming success of the Soviet Union, the state-led model in general engendered a lot of cronyism and corruption, and it wasn't able to leverage the types of gains that it can plausibly have. So, in economic theory, there are plenty of theories. Once you allow for increasing returns to scale, once you allow for kind of like deviations from perfect competition, there are lots of economic theories where potentially the state can say use tariffs to protect a small industry until it gets large enough to be competitive. So the infinite industry argument. There are other arguments based on increasing returns, where the state can make some early investments, and that can have big payoffs down the road. So in theory, there are a lot of potential gains from state if you have a model or an economic theory which allows for things like increasing returns. But in practice, those gains tend not to be realized because it's hard for the state to pick winners, and it's easy for the losers to pick the state in some sense. So there are plenty of examples of industrial policy going wrong. There's famous examples in England where the state invested in various automobile industries, and all these automobile industries went bankrupt. Famous example from Northern Ireland is DeLorean, which has been studied. So similarly, if these state enterprises get captured by unions, which relatively narrowly represent their members and not society at large, that can also lead to inefficient and costly decisions being made, technologies being blocked. So in general, the state, there are a lot of risks involved when you have such a close relationship with the state, which is partly why economists tend to be in favor of things like privatization and keeping the state sector, at least when it comes to active involvement in the economy. It's different when it comes to providing some social insurance or some safety net, but in terms of active involvement in the economy, most economists are skeptical of this. But there are counter examples, as you point out, and in some dimensions, Singapore is a counter example, as is South Korea.
Yep. And so in a way, Singapore and South Korea seem to be the exception to the rule rather than the rule itself.
Well, if you think about all the countries which try to pursue policies, almost every country that I can think of, with a few exceptions like Hong Kong or countries which were totally mired in civil war, almost all countries in the post-World War II period, they were all influenced by this idea of import substitution or state-led development, and in most countries it wasn't successful. So yeah, it was successful in a few, but you can't infer what can you infer from that. It may be limited. The South Korean and Singapore case do support the idea that the costs of state interventions in the economy are mitigated or more likely to be minimized when you have a lot of when your economy is very export driven, because the South Korean tribals within the Korean market, they were in some sense had monopoly power. So in some sense, the interventions supporting the tribals in Korea were transferring incomes from Korean consumers who were paying higher prices than they otherwise would to these firms. And that money could have been wasted, but at the same time, these Korean firms were trying to make breakthroughs into export markets, and eventually they succeeded. And the fact that they were involved in that international competition was a disciplining force, which was absent in other countries where state-led development was unsuccessful.
Yep. And one more thing about institutions that's interesting is that when you think about the Industrial Revolution, why did the Industrial Revolution happen in Europe as opposed to, say, Sub-Saharan Africa or South America or, say, India? Why did it happen in Europe?
Yeah, so that's kind of like, this is kind of getting to the core of our book, actually, the key point of our book. So the later chapters of our book really touch upon this. And I think there's several ways you can think about it, but I'll suggest one. One is to think that there's several or relatively large number of episodes in world history where there was market-led, or what we call in the book Smithian economic development. So there are other episodes in history where the economy was growing for a time, temporarily. There were increases in productivity. Often there was some innovation to some degree. So the classic examples are ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Sung China, the Middle East under the Abbasids, Italy, and in Europe in the West in the commercial revolution. And so you can think about these examples. And another one of these like effervescences was occurring in northwest Europe in the 17th century and into the 18th century. And so the question is why was this one the one which then led to sustained economic growth and kind of let the genie out of the bottle, whereas those previous episodes petered out, they didn't amount to that much in the long run. And so the key things here, I think, so there are certain things which are common to all of these episodes. So all of these episodes were in some sense market, trade, commerce driven to a large degree. But what was distinctive about what happened in England in the 18th century, what happened with the Industrial Revolution, does seem to be it was more innovation driven, and the innovations were broader based, and they kept coming. So they didn't like peter out. The economy continued to be very innovative. So several things played a role there, but we draw attention to the scientific revolution as a kind of a background condition. The Enlightenment, the work of John McCare talks about how this kind of transformed the intellectual culture of these societies. And we also talk about the specific incentives to innovate, and that's more drawing on the work of Bob Allen. So it was a period of growth, period of expansion, but what seems to be distinctive about this was that it became self-sustaining, and that has to do with the innovation. And we in the book talk about some specific examples of this. So we talk about the innovations in cotton textiles. So several successive innovations which are involved in basically transforming this process, which had been the same for thousands of years, where there was a woman with and it was a woman in general, with a spinning wheel spinning out the cotton thread, and then a man typically weaving by hand on a loom, and how that process was gradually mechanized. And it wasn't like one off. They invented this machine. No, it's really tinkering at the margins, gradually improving these devices, coming up with things like these rollers, which allow you to basically mechanize the spinning process. But you can't yet attack. This is still being powered by human power with a spinning jenny, and then later attaching this to a steam engine or to water power, and then you've mechanized spinning. But what about the loom and the weaving? Can you mechanize the weaving? So it's these successive innovations which are building on each other, cumulative innovations, which seem to be important. You could see a similar thing, I guess, in the modern period in Silicon Valley with the computer industry, how it was a confluence of different people working on these projects, making somewhat independent breakthroughs, and how they came together eventually to have an economic payoff. And that matters because sometimes scientific breakthroughs don't have an immediate economic payoff. And so it's really about the fusion of science to technology to the economy, to delivering a product which you can take to market, which is kind of critical, I think, in unleashing sustained economic growth. And that's what happens over the course of the 18th century.
Got it. Another interesting aspect is, the idea of culture. And so, you cite Daisha McCloskey's work on, values, ethics, and, how that actually influenced Europe's takeoff during the 17th and 18th centuries. And so, for example, if you take history, if you look at the Greeks and the Romans, so the Greeks and the Romans considered work to be one of the lowest value, ways to use time, as opposed to, what we're seeing, say, in the US right now. We're in the US, work in the modern day US, work is highly valued. And so how important is one, cultural values, and two, what is also interesting is if you look at places in Africa, you see that lots of parts of Africa seem to be at war with each other because, one is part of one tribe and another is part of another tribe. And do you think, that kind of separation, that kind of, various cultures existing within one landmass, has that been another thing that's been a headwind to economic growth in parts of Africa, etc.?
So yeah, a lot to unpack in that question. With regards to culture, so clearly I think at a intuitive kind of basic level, we think culture matters. The challenge is culture is endogenous to both institutions and to economic growth itself, right? So if you think about culture, well, it depends how you think about culture, but if you think about it as a set of beliefs that we hold for various reasons, we hold them. If a belief becomes too costly to hold, we may well abandon it, or if we don't abandon it, our children might. So there's some selection process going on, selecting cultural values. And so the story for culture being responsible is at some level that must be true, but culture was also responding to economic change. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Is it culture? Is it institutions? Is it something else? So that's the caveat with regards to culture, but no doubt there were cultural shifts in Northwestern Europe in particular taking place around the time we're discussing. So McCloskey has written about this kind of rise of bourgeois values. So undoubtedly the cultural values are shifting to, and they're more favorable to commerce than we saw previously. So in ancient Greece, certainly there's derivation of commerce and trade. It's Rome as well, though there are periods in Roman history where it seems less severe. There were freemen getting rich, and there were kind of senators getting indirectly involved, at least in commercial activities. So the role of culture is definitely there, but it's difficult to unpack. Was it decisive or not? And I think that's a challenge with a cultural thesis, but it's hard to provide very credible evidence. But it's the change in culture is decisive, or did the change in culture, was it also partly responding to changing other things, like changing institutions? But nonetheless, definitely cultural values matter. The story about ethno-linguistic fractionalization in Africa is an example of that. In some sense, it's a potential legacy of the way the colonial powers in Africa divided up the continent. They created borders which often intersected different ethno-linguistic groups. And then subsequent colonial institutions were often premised on the fact that their different ethnic groups were going to give the chieftain of this group some local governance responsibility. So they may have exacerbated these differences. But can you overcome them? I think they definitely can be overcome. But it sometimes requires institutional involvement and engagement and training and investment by the state to try and overcome these differences. Singapore is, of course, a country of different ethnic groups. They have the Malay, the Chinese, the Indians. There's this British legacy, so they were able to, despite in some sense, like the colonial period, there was probably a lot of racism and discrimination going on, but they were able to forge something of a common identity. So it can be done. So the institutions can overcome the culture, but is the culture relevant? Of course, definitely.
Yep, and it also seems that, for example, if you take the US or if you take Toronto, I think Toronto is the world's #1 most multicultural city, or something of that sort. And so what is interesting is that as countries get wealthier, the importance of as you mentioned, ethno-linguistic fractionalization actually seems to go down. And so as the country gets richer, people seem to care less and less about I'm living with people from country that's 2,000 kilometers from my home country. And so that
I think it gets back to the definition I was giving you for institutions, or why institutions matter. I think if you think the world is zero sum, if you think there's not much prospect to get richer except by getting stuff from other people, so this is the case. This is people in the most deprived or poorest parts of say England. They often oppose immigration, and they oppose immigration on the grounds that the immigrants are taking the houses, or they're filling up the social service. Or in the case of these people, sometimes it isn't even the jobs because they're unemployed. It's the access to, I don't think I shouldn't say that. It's the NHS, because there's specific public services which are already straining, potentially because of underfunding or because of the way they're designed. And then it's a fixed resource, and so it's natural to think about that in zero-sum terms, and you're worried about the pressure on that resource, and so you don't want other people getting it, basically. And so it's a natural human way to think about things in a world of scarcity. And so what you want the institutions to do is to direct people away from that scarcity mindset and towards a mindset of like, these people coming to the country, or these different groups have different skills. We can productively employ these people, in some way, which is going to make everyone potentially better off.
Yep. And when it comes to going back to the idea of institutions, do you think that where do you see the most common instances, or where do you see the most common, or where do you see mistakes being made today when it comes to stopping rent-seeking behavior? So rent-seeking, is for anyone who doesn't know, is like getting a piece of the pie without actually growing the pie?
So the housing, I mean, there are many examples, and I mean, but in Canada, I think this is resonant as well. So clearly, the housing issue in parts of the US, like particularly in the Bay Area, and then obviously cities in Canada, like I think Toronto, but particularly Vancouver is the most notorious. And then in the UK, the southeast of England. So the fact that housing has been limited in supply, so there are a lot of regulations over land use. So in England, actually, the so-called green belt, the area which surrounds the major cities, has grown in the last 40 years. So more land is just unused, and that's led to an artificial scarcity of housing. And then that's made housing extremely expensive, and then that creates a lot of rent-seeking competitions to get this very, very lucrative housing, and it distorts all these other markets because it prices out nurses and teachers from affluent inner city areas. It causes homelessness. And it means that, in the Bay Area, how do you attract workers? We have to pay them huge salaries, and then there are these kinds of knock-on effects from the artificial scarcity of housing. So I think if Western developed countries could get rid of inefficient land use policies, that would have a big payoff. There are other examples which I think are harder to do. So I think, like there are infrastructure projects where it would be a lot better if we could build more infrastructure more cheaply without worrying about the complaints necessarily of people whose land is going to be reallocated as a result. But I think those ones are harder to solve than the housing problem. I think it's actually relatively straightforward to massively improve the situation.
Yep. Got it. And then the next part of your book sort of talks about babies, demographics, etc. And the world seems to be as a whole on a declining demographic trend, excluding places like Africa. So if you go look at how the African population is sort of structured, you see that there's a lot more young people in Africa compared to old people. And do you think is that mostly a function of lower life expectancy in Africa, or I guess it's slightly dark to say, but is that sort of the reason, or is there actually sort of a demographic dividend that's going on in Africa? And two, what should countries be doing to sort of counter the impacts of demographic decline?
Yeah, so two parts to that, at least two parts. So the first thing I would say is that, the demographic story is actually an important part of the story, which often gets neglected. So the real dramatic rise in per capita incomes in European history occurs after the demographic transition, beginning in the late 19th century. But Oleg Galor is kind of the guy most famous for emphasizing the importance of the demographic transition. So, economic growth begins in the Industrial Revolution and incomes start going up. But they're going up quite slowly. A lot of the extra productive activity gets translated into more people, not higher incomes, not richer people. And so there's this demographic transition, which then occurs in the late 19th century, and that is associated with the period where growth really starts to take up in per capita terms. And so even when we look at East Asian countries, which really saw living standards transformed in the late 20th century, the demographic story was very important then. It often gets understated. So birth rates plummeted in Singapore and Hong Kong and these countries between, say, 1950 and 1990. And so that was partly allowed these countries to get richer, because obviously children don't work, but they don't contribute to GDP. And so if you have a lot of children in your society, that just automatically means that per capita income is measured to be lower. And so they went through a demographic transition more rapidly than other countries had, and that basically sped up their ascension to middle or high income status. But now there's a cost to that because they're aging rapidly. And so they could use at a certain point, this demographic dividend from having smaller families starts to have their costs, because you end up with a lot of old people and not very many children left to support them. So someone like Japan, its growth record in the last 20 years is pretty bad, but that's partly due to its aging population.
Right.
And so sub-Saharan Africa, they basically didn't begin going through this demographic transition until much, much later. And at the same time, they were massively hampered by the HIV/AIDS epidemic. But my understanding, without looking at the data right now, is they are going through this demographic transition. Latin America's already gone through it, and sub-Saharan Africa is going through it. So worries about overpopulation, these Malthusian worries about overpopulation are clearly overdone. Like sub-Saharan Africa will reach, a stable level of population within a couple of decades, and it's not going to overwhelm the planet in terms of numbers of people. But we do have this issue now of a lot of poorer countries with a lot of young people, rich countries with not enough young people. And I don't know good ways to solve this. I would just point out that housing is one of the stories for how to solve this, because if housing is very expensive, as is the case in a lot of Europe, then it's hard for young people to move out of their parents' house, and that's going to defer when they start families, delay when they start families. Yeah. So that could be one way to improve
high housing prices, man. I'm in Canada.
Yeah. Canadian cities are notorious. I think some of the worst, right? Vancouver, I think is
horrible. Yeah, I remember it's easier to get a new pope elected to the Catholic Church than it is to get an apartment building approved for construction in Vancouver. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one weird thing that if you notice is, so if you look at places like China, so the average parent in China spends roughly 20 to 30% of their income on one kid's education every month. So do you think, from that standpoint, if they had two children, they would end up spending, a way too large portion of their income on.
They would adjust. I mean, the China education thing is, it's partly valid human capital, it's partly signaling, and they partly think that returns to getting into very elite universities through their examination system are disproportionately high, but it's partly a product of a single child policy, that if you only have one child, you've got to put all your eggs in one basket. If they have more than one children, they might smooth it out a little bit more. But that's also a culture is also partly why East Asians tend to invest so much in education, and that can have good consequences, but it can also lead to overinvestment in some cases.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so do you think, and so, another idea that you mentioned was, so you see that a lot of these developing countries seem to have either aging populations, low birth rates, while poorer or developing countries tend to have younger people, etc. And so, broadly speaking, would you agree that immigration to places like Europe, Canada, and most importantly the US are very small? So as in the number of immigrants allowed is very small. And if so, would you agree with the idea of open borders that was put forth in Brian Kaplan's, your colleague Brian Kaplan's book?
Yeah. So there's a big difference between easier migration flows, like lowering cost migration, and open borders. So in general, I would go for something which is pragmatic and can work. So I would not even use the term open borders, because I think politically it sells very badly. It generates backlash. So, but I think you can definitely liberate those restrictions a lot more, particularly in a country like the US, which is large, has a lot of open space, has a lot of areas which could do with the influx of migrants. I'd be open to the idea of state-specific visas, although I don't know if they're constitutionally valid. So you could give someone a visa, like an H-1B visa, but rather than just now it's firm sponsored, and instead of it being firm sponsored, you could say you have a visa to set up your own business or do whatever you like, but this visa is only valid if you live in say Wyoming or Pennsylvania or Ohio. So you're not subsidizing people to go to Silicon Valley, where already it's already in some sense overcrowded, but you're saying, look, this is an opportunity to come to this part of the country, not some other part. Now, the enforcement issues there. Okay, so once you get to the country, you could just disappear. So that's the issue there. But I think there are plenty of ways of a margin where you can improve migration flows, and allow far more people to migrate without imposing large costs. I think there are issues in some European countries where we've had very dramatic, very quick inflows of refugees and asylum seekers. I think that does raise issues of integration. But it's a little bit different to economic migration. But in general, the United States could take in a lot more migrants than it does.
I would broadly agree with that. And one more idea is that you presented in the book is this idea of colonization and exploitation. And a lot of my friends who tend to be more liberal, more left wing, have argued that a lot some part of U.S. economic growth, quite a bit of it, has been caused mainly due to the slave trade and getting cheap labor to pick cotton, to grow crops, etc. And Britain got a large amount of spices and more expensive goods. I guess expensive as in luxury goods. What was luxury back then from India, etc., etc. And so, would you agree that exploitation and colonization has been a big part in terms of one, grabbing resources from poorer nations, and also two, do you think that has made a significant difference in places in almost specifically just Europe?
So I think there are two aspects to that question. One is, was colonization like a critically important part of European or world history since 1500, and was it often characterized by barbarism and atrocity and exploitation? Like, the answer to that is undoubtedly yes. So if you want to understand, you want to read up about the history of any of these countries, Britain especially, but also you're going to be reading about things like the transatlantic slave trade and the conquest of India and stuff. So it's definitely an important part of the story. But there's a separate question, which is really that's a historian's question. Separate question is really an economist question, which is saying what was key to the origins of sustained economic growth, which happens to be in Western Europe. And so the answer to the second question, if you start to think about colonial exploitation and empire, you have to kind of think about several things. One, the amount which was looted from someone like McCloskey makes a lot of these points. The amount that was looted from, say, India or other parts of the world. If you think so, firstly, a lot of Britain's empire, say in sub-Saharan Africa, was conquered after the Industrial Revolution. So the empire it had before, we're thinking about the Caribbean, the 13 colonies of the eastern seaboard of the United States, Canada, and then the Indian subcontinent, really. And so if you think about all the looting, all the stuff that like Diamond Pitt or Robert Clive took from India, that's trivial compared to the increase in GDP that we see over the next 200 years, right? So it can't just be a transfer story. It just doesn't work. Just numerically or arithmetically, it doesn't work. And similarly, we have many other examples of empires. We have the Roman Empire, right? The Romans sacked cities like Carthage and Corinth. They pillaged large parts of the world, and they took all these riches to Rome, right? And did it enrich Romans? Yeah, it enriched elite Roman senators who stole all this stuff, and they got loads of slaves. They became very rich as a result. But the Roman economy didn't have sustained economic growth. And there, obviously, history is littered with empires. For all of history, there have been empires, and they've been stealing stuff and enslaving people. And so those two arguments should just caution one about thinking that the pillaging of empire was critical to the story of economic growth. Now, it could have played a role, but you have to tell a much more fine-grained, kind of, intricate story about how the exploited wealth taken from India or taken from the Caribbean, how that was then channeled into particular investments, which then led to, innovations and led to rapid explosive growth. And in general, my reading of the evidence is just not there. So individual British people are becoming rich as a result of the Caribbean, and sugar is coming into Britain cheaper than it otherwise would. Cotton is going into America cheaper than it otherwise would. So there are benefits. But if I think about what made the Industrial Revolution, I'm thinking about these breakthroughs in technology in Lancashire, like the spinning jenny or the water frame, which are really just making the productive process more efficient. And those guys like James Watts or James Hargreaves, they're raising the money on their own capital. They're not directly benefiting from the slave trade or from India. So right. For me, it's a background condition. It was, if you imagine no empire, if you do that counterfactual, Britain is probably poorer, right? But it still might have had an industrial revolution.
Yep, yep. And so in a way, it's sort of what they do with the resources more than the fact that they took them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think you have to recognize that, like, taking stuff, that's a constant almost in human history. I mean, true, the colonial period was on a larger scale, that arguably, like, the slave period was on a larger scale.
Taking stuff.
Yeah, but taking stuff was always happening before.
Another important point, or another interesting point that you mentioned, is that you talked about European fragmentation, and so historically, say in the 1700s, and in fact, all the way before that, say during the Roman Empire. So almost every ruler or every major ruler in Europe has had the mission to take over the whole of Europe, the whole of the European continent, and establish one unified nation. And so we saw that with the Roman Empire, and then more recently in say the 1900s, we saw that with Hitler, who again wanted to rule a great part of Europe. And what you talk about is, or what you mentioned, is that the failure of European rulers to rebuild a continent-wide empire after the fall of Rome resulted in a period of economic decline and military weakness, the so-called Dark Ages, but it also laid the foundations for long-term economic growth. Could you explain? Could you explain how that works?
Yeah. So briefly, the empires have some advantages. So you integrate. You don't have tariffs between parts of an empire. You can have a single currency potentially linking together an empire. The empire has some benefits in terms of increasing the scale and size of a market, and that leads to more trade, more specialization, more division of labor. So in some sense, you might think empire is good, and you see some of the advantages of empire in the Roman period and also in China. But the downside of it is that you get like you tend to have a monocentric one-size-fits-all set of political institutions. And so if one country, or if that society goes into decline, if its institutions decay for whatever reason, it's going to affect the entirety of the empire. The benefits of a more decentralized system is that even though their costs, right, these European states are constantly at war, they're imposing tariffs on each other, but they're also competing with each other for, say, attracting scientists, or they're competing because they want more tax revenue. So they're willing to encourage trade and manufacturing. And if one of them makes a quote unquote mistake or pursues stupid policies, that doesn't affect what's going on in another city state or another policy which can adapt and innovate. So there seems to be some dynamic benefit from having a more polycentric state system. And that seems particularly true. The benefits became particularly important after the scientific revolution in the 17th, 18th century. And John McKay has written about this in his book about the culture of economic growth. The idea that, by that point, European scientists and innovators were culturally unified. So Europe, it wasn't like they were fragmented into countries where they didn't talk to each other. From an intellectual perspective, it was one unit. Europe was Europe. But because of politically, they were separated. If the French persecuted the Huguenots and pursued kind of policies which were bad for commerce, the English and the Dutch would reap the benefits and just allow the Huguenots in and so on. And if a book was banned in Southern Europe, it could be published in the Netherlands. So those are the types of benefits you get from a more decentralized state system.
Got it. And when we take the opposite of a decentralized state system, when we take when we take, for example, the Soviets, you've written I guess you could call like a part of a chapter titled "The Soviet Detour." And would you broadly agree that the failure of the Soviet system was bad incentives and bad institutions, where the institutions didn't really incentivize wealth creation, but because there was not much you could do with the wealth, but more so people just tried to do as less work as they could because they got whatever they would get healthcare regardless of what they did.
So I would say basically that's right. But it's the incentive story. There are two aspects to socialist economies. One is the incentive problem. One is the information problem, which is kind of the Hayek Mises critique of them. So how do you efficiently get what the information about what needs to be produced, about relevant scarcities. How do you convey that information in the absence of without a price system? Now, the Soviet Union, when it initially starts, it's forged out of a terribly brutal civil war, and it's a very autocratic dictatorship. So actually, the incentives are a little bit different to what you suggest, in the sense that you were incentivized to work really hard, otherwise you might go to the gulag. So they actually do incentivize a lot of work. They reward it. Actually, they're so-called Stakhanovites. They did encourage. Stalin introduces differential pay actually in the early 30s. So they actually encouraged a lot of. They mobilized a lot of labor, a lot of work. They didn't really allow anyone to be unemployed, and they mobilized a lot of labor, and so they are able to grow at some level for some period of time. The trouble comes later, the inability to produce high quality consumer goods, the inefficiencies build up, the difficulty when it comes to innovation, the difficulty when it comes to producing more complex manufactured goods. So the costs show up over time, but once they show up, they're really very real. And the Soviet Union was in real trouble by the late 60s, I think. It only continued because the oil shocks allowed Russia to earn a lot of revenues by exporting natural resources and oil. But yeah, I think we describe it as it's not a path to long-lasting, sustained economic growth.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and well, let's come to today's world. And so in today's world, what you see is large parts of places like India. While India is changing fast, you see that large parts are still agrarian. Where when you look at the U.S., you see a large part of it services, manufacturing, etc. And so, do you think for an economy to be successful in the modern age, it will likely have to adapt to as more services or more manufacturing, or how would you what do you think is going to happen roughly in the future?
Yeah, this is a tricky question. One argument I think Paul Collier made it around 10 years ago, which is that China's success as a manufacturing hub closed off that door to many other countries. So basically, once China became a center for world's kind of cheap manufacturing, it became difficult for countries in sub-Saharan Africa to replicate China's path, because China could just sell cheap electronic goods or cheap manufactured goods at a lower price than anything a Kenya or an Ethiopia could do. So that limited their path to economic development. So if you think about countries like India or other countries in the developing world, services have offered one avenue, particularly countries like India or the Philippines, which have relatively good English language skills. So you get call centers, and technology could be facilitating this. So as internet video becomes more and more pervasive, I've heard of coffee shops in the US or dentists where you're checked in by somebody in the Philippines. So you could have more of those types of service jobs potentially being traded internationally. But if China upskills more, then if wages go up and keep going up in China, then it opens up the possibility for lower wage competition from poorer parts of the world in Africa or other parts of Asia. So that's kind of what I have to say right now. I could think about the question more, but it's different dimensions to it. But I think that the possibility of growth, though, it really does rest a lot on. Right now, we're seeing a lot of successive negative shocks in the world economy. So price of energy, disruptions due to the Ukrainian-Russian war, inflation. So I suspect this could be a pretty tricky time. But it's always hard to. But that said, like if you have peace and resumption of globalization, I mean, supply chains have also been knocked out by COVID. So once those things can recover, then I think many more opportunities will arise in the developing world for trade and other ways to access the world economy, because I think that's crucial. I think if countries turn inwards, then they really lose out a lot in terms of the potential growth.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And so, if you had to pick three countries to be, I guess, bullish on, say, in the next 20 to 30 years, which three would you pick in terms of economic growth?
So it's a tricky question because you haven't given me any chance to prepare this.
That's why it's fun.
Vietnam, Philippines, Thailand, potentially.
Got it. And so, for a lot, so broadly speaking, then for parts of, say, South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, so the broad change that really needs to be made is to build stronger institutions that incentivize the quote unquote right kind of behavior.
Yeah, so South America is a part of the world I know less about, but if you look at someone like Argentina, they kind of continuously choose politicians who put in place broadly the same set of inflationary policies, and so countries in South America, it seems I'm cautious about them. Mexico, Mexico has a big problem with violence on its border and with drug trade. Mexico has done very well in the last 20 years, and Mexico obviously has the big advantages of proximity to the US, right? So that's a huge export market. Mexico's a leading manufacturing economy. So of the countries in the Americas, Mexico is the one where which is on course, and others maybe have upsides as well that I'm just not as familiar with. It seems to be dispiriting. A country like Chile seems to have been embroidered in crisis despite having pursued, having had a very successful record of growth in the last 20 years. So I think part of the issue for countries like that is overcoming the so-called middle income trap. So middle income trap occurs once a country becomes settled, rich enough, then kind of the urgency to grow isn't so central, and then countries can end up pursuing more rent-seeking policies, and they can end up being trapped in middle income status.
Mm-hmm. I see. And one other broad shift that we're seeing right now is, for example, if you take Canada, and if you took the average, if you look at what's called the median voter theorem, or the median voter, you see that they sort of moved further left compared to, say, 1990. So in 1990, you saw that Bill Clinton, a Democrat, was running a fiscal surplus. But then, today what you're seeing is you're sort of slowly starting to see a reversal of that. So would you broadly agree that the median voter has shifted to the left? And two, do you think that has any strong implications for economic growth?
Yeah, so the premise I'm not sure about is if median voter has shifted. I mean, yeah, if to the extent it's going to be, to the extent that they've shifted to the left, that means they're more likely to favor kind of policies which are encouraging redistribution of existing resources as opposed to the creation of new resources. Then that's going to lead to less growth, or else equal, would be my position. The issue is sometimes the two-dimensional median voter theorem is a bit limited, I feel. So if you think about a country like the US, the culture wars are so vivid, they're so real, that if you have at least, it's not a single thing. You can't collapse the US political landscape onto a single dimension, in my view. And so that complicates things to a large degree. And in the case of but I would be concerned if the median voter had moved to the left on economic issues.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Well, with that, Mark, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It was wonderful having you. And for anyone listening, you should 100% go and get How the World Became Rich: The Historical Origins of Economic Growth. I think you can find that on Amazon. And I'll put the link in the description as well, just so that people can find it.
That'd be great. Right now, it's backlogged, so it's gonna take a while to arrive, but hopefully they're gonna print more copies soon. So
okay, so it looks like Mark is a celebrity.
Hardly, but yeah, thanks for having me, and it was fun. So I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for being on.